So beautiful. Thank you. Before we get started, I forgot to ask you to pass the friendship pads. Please go ahead and take those. And as you do, take one of the purple sheets out of them. A little bit later, we're going to be doing a meditation. You're going to have a chance to write down some people that you want to ask forgiveness from or people who you need to forgive in your life. And so make sure that you have a pencil. Take a look as you pass the pew pads back and forth and see who it is that you're worshiping next to. Our first scripture reading comes from the book of Colossians. Listen carefully for the word of God. As God's own, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, and patience, forgiving each other, just as the Lord has forgiven you. And crown all of these things with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. One of my favorite passages in the whole Bible. I believe that most of us, when we get into this whole Christian adventure, we have no idea what a revolutionary thing it is that we're signing ourselves up for. What a radical reorientation it involves in everything that we know and understand about life and the world and living in it. Today, I want to talk about the secret sauce of the Christian gospel. I want to talk about the motherlode of Christian discipleship, the falcon heavy, to pay homage to our old parish associate, Amanda Riley, and her husband Bill, who is one of the main people involved in launching that rocket that we watched go up and then land a couple of weeks ago. I want to talk to you about the power of forgiveness. Jesus told a parable that I think gets to the heart of this radical sort of reorientation that we all need to be a part of in our life and our world together as Christians. It's told in the book of Matthew, and it's the only place in the whole Bible that this story is told. It caps off a long segment where Jesus is talking to his disciples about what it means, what their relationship should look like in light of this new revolution, this era that Jesus is inaugurating in our world. And so, in the 21st verse of the 18th chapter of Matthew, Peter approaches Jesus and he sort of lays it all out on the line. He says, "Jesus, how many times am I expected to forgive my brother when he wrongs me?" I mean, he knows what he's doing, but he just does it anyway. How many times am I expected to forgive? Would it be up to 7 times? And it's interesting because it's very clear in the Jewish scriptures exactly what Peter is thinking here. From the book of Amos, it was clear to the Jews that they were expected to forgive each other up to 3 times when they had been wronged. And so Peter is being very magnanimous here, right? He's saying, well, what if I double the minimum expectation and I add 1 on top? Surely that should be enough. But then Jesus kind of knocks him off of his high horse and says, well, maybe not 7 times, more like 77 times. Or as some scholars believe, that is 7 times 70 times, which would be 490. And then immediately, Jesus launches into this parable. Peter came to Jesus and asked, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times?" And Jesus answered, "I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. "Be patient with me," he begged, "and I will pay back everything." The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. "Pay back what you owe me," he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, "Be patient with me, and I will pay it back." But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. And then the master called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said, "I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had on you?" In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you, unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. It's a weird little parable, easily broken into 3 parts. First, the one servant who owes his king, his master, some unimaginable astronomical figure. They say bags of gold. It's funny the way they've translated this so many different ways. It was always 10,000 talents. I guess they just have given up trying to figure out exactly how much a talent is. They know that it was probably about the most amount of money that there was. A lot of scholars believe that 10,000 talents would have been in today's money the equivalent of billions or even $1 trillion, sort of the debt of an entire small country. So obviously there was no way, if working full-time, he could have made up that debt in 150,000 years. And yet the king forgives him and releases him from the debt. Part 2, he goes out and he talks to his fellow servant who owes him. This is, they say, 100 denarii, which would be the equivalent of a couple of $1,000, something he could have easily paid off. And yet this servant is so cold-hearted that he refuses, right after being forgiven this incredibly enormous debt, he refuses this relatively small debt. And then the third part where the master finds out and he throws him in prison to be tortured and isolated for the rest of his life. It's kind of a disturbing parable, isn't it? And I think maybe more than anything because it seems to run so contrary to everything I understand about God's mercy and forgiveness, about who Jesus was and why Jesus came and what Jesus wants to do in our lives. I mean, what it seems to be saying is that we're not going to be forgiven unless we forgive, and so therefore we should be forgiving out of fear and sort of a greedy sense of self-centeredness, right? It just doesn't seem to make all that much sense, and it doesn't seem to jive with what I know about God. And so it leaves me asking the question, is there something that I'm missing here? Is there something that I don't understand that's going on under the surface of this parable? Is there something that I don't understand about forgiveness? And I think there is. A lot of things that we tend not to understand about forgiveness. I think there are a lot of things that our society generally thinks about forgiveness, which is the exact polar opposite of what Jesus came to try to teach us with this new revolution of his. I think there are so many misconceptions that we have about forgiveness. For starters, so often we think of forgiveness as an exercise in excusing wrongs, right? When nothing could be further from the truth. If what someone has done to us is okay, or if there's an excuse for what they've done, then there's no need for forgiveness, right? Forgiveness is only needed when it's clear that something wrong has been done. Lewis Smedes, who used to be at Fuller, says, Excusing someone for a wrong that they've done is a cheap substitute for the more difficult job of forgiving. It's also so often in our society that we link together this whole idea of forgiving and forgetting, right? We're supposed to forgive and forget. But the two don't necessarily go together. When it works out, when we're able to forgive someone and then let go of the thing that hurt us and forget about it, that can be a wonderfully freeing thing. But there are times when we can't forget. In fact, I would go as far as to say there are times where it would be downright irresponsible to forget. The truth is that someone who's been through the Holocaust, they need to forgive if they're ever going to move on, but we can't ever, it would be wrong of us to forget about the Holocaust, right? Forgiveness and forgetting, sometimes they go together, but not always. It's the same thing for reconciliation. If our forgiving someone leads to a reconciliation, a restoration of the relationship, that can be a beautiful thing for both sides. But it's not always possible. And it's not always wise. C.S. Lewis talks about finally forgiving a man who had been dead for 30 years. Forgiveness is a unilateral thing that we do in our own hearts, whether the person we're forgiving even knows it or not. When a woman finally gets the courage to stand up to her abuser and leave a house where she's being abused, the hard reality is she will never be truly free until she's able to forgive, but that does not mean that she should be restoring the relationship. There are times when we need to forgive. Forgiveness is always the right thing. Restoring the relationship, reconciliation, may not be. Which leads us to what I believe is the most pervasive misconception, the most paralyzing misconception of all. And this really lies at the heart of this parable. It lies at the heart of our Christian faith. It lies at the heart of everything we tend to not understand about forgiveness. And that is that we tend to think that forgiveness is primarily an obligation that we have to our master, to God, or a gift to the one that we're forgiving. The truth of the matter, and this is so important for us to understand, the truth of the matter is the greatest beneficiary of our forgiveness is ourselves. We are the ones who are freed. We are the ones who are empowered when we forgive. Archbishop Desmond Tutu says that forgiveness is the best form of self-interest. Martin Luther King said that far from being the pious requirement of utopian dreamers, the commandment to forgive is an absolute necessity for our survival. Because what these two men knew in all that they experienced and all that they saw, they knew what unforgiveness can do to the human body and soul. They had seen the way that it can eat people alive from the inside out. And they had also seen and experienced the incredible freedom and release that comes from finally forgiving someone. When we are unable, when we refuse or are unable to forgive someone who has hurt us, we think that somehow is hurting them, but it's not. We are the ones who are trapped inside of a prison that we can't escape. We are the ones who are being eaten from the inside out by a cancer that continues to grow and eventually spills out and ruins all of our relationships and everything else that goes on in our lives. They say that refusing to forgive, being unable to forgive, is like holding a red-hot coal and wondering why the one who gave it to us isn't being burned. Or else that unforgiveness is like drinking rat poison and then waiting for the rat to die. C.S. Lewis once said, I can't get my mind wrapped around this idea of how it is that we are supposed to forgive. That when we forgive others, we are supposed to be looking beyond what they've done and understanding the person behind. He said he thought it was a silly impossibility. This whole idea that you're supposed to somehow hate the sin but love the sinner, as if we could possibly separate the two. What he said in Mere Christianity was this. But years later, it occurred to me that there was one man to whom I had been doing this all my life, namely myself. However much I might dislike my own cowardice or conceit or greed, I went on loving myself. There had never been the slightest difficulty about it. In fact, it was precisely because I loved myself that I was sorry to find that I was the sort of person who did these things. He goes on to say, consequently, Christianity does not want us to reduce by one atom the hatred we feel for cruelty or treachery. We ought to hate them. But it does want us to hate them in the same way in which we hate these things in ourselves. Being sorry that the person should have done such things, and hoping, if in any way possible, that somehow, sometime, somewhere, they might be cured and made human again. Which brings us, in a winding, circuitous way, back to our parable. Because what's going on here is that when we truly understand what God has done for us, that God has released us from the small country worth of debt, the 150,000 year to pay back kind of debt, then suddenly not only does it become obvious that we ought to forgive others for the stupid and the dumb things that they do in the ways that they unintentionally or even intentionally hurt us, but when we really understand all that Jesus went through, all that Jesus sacrificed just for the privilege of being able to forgive us for who we are and what we've done, and the things that we think in the dark recesses of our minds and our hearts where no one else is looking, that if God gave so much to forgive us for those things, not only does it make it silly for us not to forgive those around us, but it becomes so much easier. To the point that it no longer really matters if it's 3 times or 7 times or 77 times or 490 times. Because forgiveness is no longer an obligation or a burden. It's something that releases an incredible kind of energy and freedom. So that by the time we get to 77, we're just getting warmed up. We don't want it to ever end. Which brings me to one final insight that I've had over this past year. And that is that we don't even necessarily need to see eye to eye or completely agree with each other before we're able to forgive or ask for forgiveness. I mean, so often we find ourselves saying, you know, I'd be happy to forgive them if they'd just realize that what they did was wrong and ask for my forgiveness. And yet what I've been realizing, particularly this last year, is we may have different opinions about something. I may not always see eye to eye with exactly what somebody thinks, but there's always something that I can ask for forgiveness for. That any time that feelings have been hurt and there's been frustration or anger or a broken relationship, that there's always a part of that I can ask forgiveness for. And so I know that we are all mostly in our leadership is saying it's time to move on and we need to leave done everything that happened in this last heartbreaking year. But I just want to say one more time how sorry I am for all of the heartache, the confusion, and the frustration. If you are one of those who felt like we could have done things differently or should have done things differently, or we should have made different decisions, I am so sorry. If you're one of those who thought we should have said a lot less or should have said a lot more, should have said things differently, I am so sorry. If you were someone who felt like you or someone that you loved and cared about was deeply hurt, if you felt judged or resented, if you felt like you weren't listened to or taken seriously, I am so sorry. Or if you were one of those who just felt forgotten and left behind and lost, we were so crazy, being so consumed with everything else, I am so sorry. And if there's anything that I could have done to have been stronger or better or more, I am sorry. I hope you'll accept my apology from the bottom of my heart. And the last thing I want to say is thank you. Because at the same time, I have also this year learned some amazing lessons about grace and mercy and forgiveness from so many of you who've come up or taken communion and stared me deep in the eyes, taken communion from me when I know that you are upset and angry about all that was happening. People who in 100 different ways have expressed their forgiveness and their love and their grace and their mercy. Reminding me once again that once it becomes a habit, once we start forgiving and we start to experience the freedom and the release that comes with that and feeds the weariest parts of our souls, then suddenly forgiveness is no longer an obligation. It's no longer something that we need to do. It is a gift. And we stop counting whether it's been 7 or 77 or 490 times, because how many times we forgive becomes a moot point, because we get more energy and more love every time we do it. And before we know it, it's no longer something we do, but it's something that we are. And by the time it's something we are, we hope that it will never end. So who is it that you need to forgive or ask forgiveness from in your life? Sometimes it's things that have happened to us as children, when we were young. Oftentimes it's people in our family or our workplace or our community or even our church. In a few moments, we're going to be going into a meditation, and you'll be given a chance to write down on your purple sheets the names of some people that you need to forgive, the names of some people you need to ask forgiveness from. Who is it for you? Because there is an unbelievable freedom when we understand that God has forgiven us lavishly and graciously for everything we are and everything that we've done, and invites us to understand that forgiving those in our life releases us from our own prisons that threaten to destroy us.